Take
Well,
care.
thank you. Henry Huckamaki. Follow him on Twitter
See you,
at
Adnan.
Huck1995 and listen to Guerrilla History, co-hosted by Professor Adnan Hussein, who joins us today from Queen's University, Kingston, Ontario. He is the chairman of the religion department, as well as the host of the Mudgeless podcast. And joining us is Dr. Liam O'Mara. He ran for Congress, almost won, in Riverside, California. And he is a professor of history. And he's joining us somewhere up in the mountains above San Bernardino. And it's good to see you.
Howdy, good to be here again.
Thank you for both of you. Last week we talked about fascism. Dr. Liam O'Mara teaches fascism. He doesn't teach how to be a fascist. If he does, I'd be interested in taking that.
Interesting curriculum.
Yeah.
No.
You wanted to talk about Gramsci and fascism and continue the discussion. And I'm going to let Professor Hussein take the lead here on this in a second. But first, Bessemer, Alabama. I've got to bug up my Jeff Bezos about Bessemer. Do you think we're making a good enough case to the American people? How do we communicate the idea of unions better than we did in Bessemer? I'll ask Dr. O'Mara this question first. How can we sell people on unions? And
it's a tough question because there's two parts of it that I'd point to. One is unions have stepped away from a lot of the really strongly leftist emphasis in education of workers. So people don't understand the interaction between what they get from the union and the political process in the way that we used to. It used to be much clearer who the enemy was, and you could build a sense of class consciousness. And we've steadily lost that over the last century. It's gotten weaker and weaker and weaker. And that makes it harder to make the case. So if somebody is going to be following a lot of, say, very conservative or neoliberal politicians and in a union, they're going to have a hard time seeing the relationship there. And related to that, I think a lot of the unions have gotten a lot more comfortable with working with the owner class in order to preserve what little they have left, because with automation and everything else and the changes in laws and, things pushed through by successive administrations to make things harder, they've had to fight to hold on to what little power they have left rather than fighting to expand the power of unions, which requires a very different rhetorical style. So rather than really engaging in that kind of evangelism, they've just gotten kind of tight with that. And that leads to a bit more corruption in it, and also makes it harder to make the case that there is a real problem with, the bosses and the owners, because, hey, the union's working pretty well with them and, praising them because, hey, we got these great benefits for you. But right. It's a downward spiral. And I think right. The Republicans have done a great job in packaging their ideas in a way that, plays into those weaknesses we have on our side.
Right. Professor Hussein, you articulated it perfectly last week when you talked about organizing professors or adjunct professors.
I think what Liam just mentioned is so crucial. He's absolutely right. I mean, I think the other one aspect of it is that it's hard to explain what a union is for if there haven't been actions and organizing and activity that's showing gains or wins that's easy to communicate to people broadly in the public. So then you end up having this more abstract discussion about why we should have our union recognized, which is, it has to be articulated in abstract terms, working conditions, and what you could achieve with it rather than the concrete goals that you might have, and so that's one thing that I find is difficult with organizing for recognition of a union when it's not tied to concrete demands that you can convince people around. to combine, for example, a demand for a pay raise, more sick days, or something with the recognition of the union, I think might at least be helpful. But I think the other issue is that with the opening up and the liberalization of trade laws, it's so easy for owners to move production elsewhere where the laws might prevent union organizing. And so it's a wonderful technique for dividing the working class across national lines, and it's very hard to develop the forms of international solidarity that could match the way in which capital moves so easily globally under these trade regimes. So it's a very, very difficult task organizing. I mean, how do you organize workers in the whole NAFTA zone, for example, in order to prevent production just moving where it can exploit labor and force all wages and all conditions to improve, right? That's just so hard to do. Whereas the governments are able to create these agreements that allow capital to circulate. This is a problem that I don't think the labor struggle has really figured out a good answer to at this point. And until we do, it's hard to articulate after 30 or 40 years of rollbacks, declining, labor organizing. But I really liked Liam's point also about the coziness of the union and, union leadership and executives kind of cooperating and working together so much that it's hard to really say what is the union really for if you're not part of a union. And it allows the right wing to characterize unions as just a closed shop, a kind of labor aristocracy that's unfair. You want a job, but you can't get one because it's unionized and you have to join the union. So they use these kinds of tactics and arguments, and we haven't been very good at refuting them.
Yeah. Is there a way the government, I mean, if Bernie were president, would he have a labor secretary who would change laws on who gets to be a union leader and what the salaries are? I mean, can the federal government save the unions from themselves? Who's going to say, I mean, who's going to?
There certainly are changes we can make in terms of laws and regulation that would make it easier for organizers to push back against it, especially since frequently the bosses are so determined to prevent organization. But I think a lot more of it just has to happen at the grassroots level. People have to get better at organizing themselves and recover some of that spirit. And maybe that might mean organizing whole new unions and creating them and getting them recognized as opposed to working within particular structures that exist. I don't know, but I think a lot of it has to come from the ground up as well, because even if the state intervenes, the right can still play on that rhetorically. They can still point to it as a kind of hierarchical solution that's taking away your freedom as a worker. They've done really well with all that right to work bullshit. And wow, right to work states have so much worse worker protections and wages. But rhetorically, freedom works for Americans. And if you give them that advantage, they will drive it home.
Yeah, it just seems when I was a kid, we knew who the labor leaders were. George Meany, AFL-CIO, and he was constantly going in and out of the White House and, literally negotiating with the president and Congress. When Joe Biden unveiled his infrastructure bill, the first thing he did was say, I brought in 150 business leaders. Jamie Dimon from JP Morgan Chase has given us the go. I mean, it seems to me that we need a Democratic Party that's going to prop up unions by, for lack of a better word, celebrating them, making celebrities out of Richard Trumka or whomever. But that's not happening. I think the only thing that's going to save the unions is a federal government that props the unions up. Because I can't
party, or at least a party willing to do it. And it's sad to say that problem is a little bit older than I am. From the beginning of the 1970s, in 1971, the Democratic Party started shifting its emphasis to the professional classes, to the educated, to big urban elites, and away from labor unions. And their influence steadily declined decade after decade since then. And at this point, union membership is lower than at any time since before the Great Depression. They're just not relevant enough. And the Democrats just take them for granted that they'll vote for them. So they don't really need to involve them in the process. And the only way to reverse that is to reverse the facts on the ground, which is to increase more, get more union membership, get more activism there. Then the party can take us seriously, and then we can get some government involvement.
So when they talk about democracy in the workplace, earlier today, we were talking with Roriki Hutchinson from Weekly Marks, which he does with Professor Adnan Hussein. We had Christian Smalls from Stop Amazon Now, and Maximilian Alvarez, who is the editor-in-chief of Real News. And they were saying, well, you can sell workers on unions by talking about democracy in the workplace. And today we're going to talk about fascism. And I said, really? Democracy in the workplace? That's the word democracy? You're going to sell workers on democracy in the workplace? I've worked, since I was 16. It's never been a democracy. It's always been fascism. How do you, it feels like a pipe dream to hear that there could ever be democracy in the workplace. What does that mean, democracy in the workplace?
I want to say at first, Adnan has something to say, so I'm not, monopolizing this, but I actually had a fun conversation last night with a couple of self-declared conservatives on this issue of democracy in the workplace, and had someone.
What does it mean?
Hi, I'm a Republican, and they were straight up signing up with what is an explicitly socialist idea. So it depends on how you talk about it. So
what does it mean? What does democracy in the workplace mean?
Well, I think one component of what it means is that the autocratic boss who makes all the decisions that everyone has to simply obey because they understand what should be done is a big myth. And there's a lot of evidence, and everybody who's worked in a group knows that sometimes the boss, the person who's supposedly in charge, knows the least about what actually should be done because they're not so involved in the process of the actual work. And the workers, the people who are involved, can make decisions about, how much they should be producing, at what time, and what way they should go about producing it, and making some of those kinds of decisions. That's what it means to have democracy in the workplace. That's what it means to have workers being more in control of the means of production. It means that they make decisions. How long should we work? What kinds of things should we make? How should we make them? How much of it should we make? These kinds of things could be organized by workers themselves who are intimately knowledgeable about the process of their daily work. Why does it have to be in the hands of some autocrat issuing commands from on high?
Right, and there are stages toward that. One thing that honestly gets to be a bit problematic there too is especially since a lot of our rhetoric then kind of pits people against the bosses. Well, a lot of like the middle management type people, they're working class too. They got a salary. They're just put in ahead of you. And it's the system that's the problem. The system imposes a hierarchy and someone is taking a job and that puts them in a hierarchical relationship. But the fact is they do have more power than me. So what you'd want to do is move gradually toward a system where you're essentially electing your bosses. Not everyone wants to lead. Some of us just want to take our smoke breaks and punch the clock, do our work and go home. And others really want to take charge and lead a project. So letting people gravitate toward those things and letting them move into it, that makes sense. But there should be consent from the workers. It shouldn't be as top-down and hierarchical a process.
Okay, so I apologize. I'm being a little oppositional, but I'm being honest. So Bessemer, Amazon workers, how do you, you're asking them to vote for a union and you're selling them on this abstraction of democracy in the workplace. Realistically, do you think it's that's a selling point? Do you think that the workers in Bessemer, oh yeah, I'd like to vote, and Jeff Bezos is going to take, I can vote for whether or not we should be moving books or CDs in this warehouse? I mean, do they expect any input? I don't think so.
No, and in that case, I don't think it's really relevant, but I can make a connection back to something that Adnan said earlier about having a goal in union organizing. And democracy in the workplace is a goal. It's something that you have to take steps towards. It's not like something we're going to get this right now in this contract, we're going to change the entire system, but it's a way of getting people to think about their investment in the workplace. So I'll give you the example from the conversation last night, where I had somebody ask me, so I don't know, what even is socialism? What's the whole point here? So I basically broke it down along the ownership aspect of it, because people will often argue, and you get this from the right all the time in the US, well, the business owner took the risk and they took those loans out and they started the company and they worked the 60-hour weeks and they poured everything into it and created the company. So why do you think you deserve a share of that? Like you should just take whatever scraps they give you. I mean, that, and the response to that would be, well, how much more motivated would people be to make the company successful if they had a share of it from the beginning? Think of the co-op model. I mean, we've got a great grocery store chain out here, Winco, that is a co-op. Everybody who works there owns a share of it. So the profit margin directly impacts their lives. It's not just fighting for whatever salary or wage you're going to get. You get a percentage of that. And I think that as a model could appeal to anybody on right or left, because it appeals to that same, bogus human nature-y type arguments they'll make about, profit and everything else. Well, yeah, you're increasing your own share, your own profit by making the company succeed, but it's not just doing it to make the boss rich. I mean, it literally brings you into it as well.
And a model that Amazon was trying was giving stock to the employees. Once they raised it to $15 an hour, they took away giving the stock to the employees. But yeah, there's a simple way to, I'm sorry?
It's similar, but it's not quite the same thing. And that's where connecting it to the term you're talking about, workplace democratization, matters, because stock is going to be non-voting stock. It still gives them no real stake in it. It's just an extra way to make a little extra cash. It's just another piece of a compensation package, in the same way as all other benefits are. Where it's, hey, we'll give you dental or whatever if you shut up and stop striking. It's right. Just another benefit. But if it's actually giving them a say in it, if it actually involves them in the company in some way and makes them a part of it, instead of it being owned by shareholders who don't actually work there. And that's where it's a completely different model. We have this hierarchical system with shareholders who are not directly involved in running the company at all, a board that represents the shareholders, and the company is about making profit for the shareholders. What if it was owned directly by the people who worked there? I got the job, I'm now a part owner of the company, and all the profit that doesn't go back into running the business is divided up amongst the workers and not a kind of parasitical investor class.
Okay, so before we get to that, one of the steps before that is to tell CalPERS and all these pension funds that run union pensions that they're not majority stockholders, but they're significant shareholders in these Fortune 500 companies that work against workers, like CalPERS, the teachers union. We're talking about trillions of dollars in pensions that are managed not by the unions, but by hedge funds and money managers who have significant voting rights with these corporations. I think one of the biggest crimes of the past 40 years is how unions have abrogated their responsibility to protect their financial investments. They're supposed to provide pensions for their workers, and instead they ask the enemy, hedge fund managers, to manage their workers' pensions. That before work, go ahead, Professor Hussein.
Oh, no, just that, these are the kind of contradictions of the system, because if they're in the position of stockholders, right? I mean, their responsibility, they will say, is that they need to maximize the income from this fund so that they can make sure that the workers receive the pension benefit that they were promised. And yet, in doing so, they may be undermining, by enhancing the profitability and so on. They may be enhancing the oppression of workers or the loss of jobs and so on. It's a problem. It's a real contradiction. And if you asked these union pension funds to work in a slightly more, what we might say, ideological manner where they advocate for workers' rights, this will be seen as violating, the responsibility that they have to the workers. So what we have here is really a failure of being able to imagine solidarity in much more global terms to realize that the particular income you might get is only one small component of a system that is still depriving you of the security that you deserve as a worker. And if we actually did use these sort of funds, there are means by which you could definitely take over companies. You could change the structure.
You could demand that 40% of the board is union reps.
That they have representation on it. Yeah, these kinds of things could be. But that's why you need, I think, a much more aggressive and ambitious union leadership that envisions these possibilities, especially in the conditions that Liam mentioned, where they're fighting just to preserve the small benefits that they have. It seems that that's a losing battle. So the tactics really ought to change, and in some ways, why not go for a much more aggressive approach? I mean, with the resources that you have, and see if that can turn the tide, because it would be very unexpected, I think, to have union pension funds, and especially if they pool together and work together, so that they have the resources to be able to take over sectors of the economy conceivably and turn them into more like worker cooperatives. That would be quite fascinating.
And just in terms of boldness overall, I think that if we really want to recapture the working class and get people identifying with the unions again and thinking, we have to give them a dream. When you give people bold dreams and bold plans, you can motivate them. You can get them to come out there and put the work in and sacrifice. But if it's all like, well, there's not much we can do about it this year, it's really hard to get anyone to give a damn and actually show up to the union meetings. So who's going to sit there in the hall and listen to somebody say, well, our negotiations didn't go well? They want to hear militancy. And if you give people that, more people will sign up and get interested in the fight. And it's a long struggle, but I mean, obviously it was in the first place. The 40-hour work week didn't happen overnight. It cost a lot of lives and a lot of years, but we got there.
So democracy in the workplace, I'm going to be oppositional here because we're going to eventually get to fascism. Democracy in the workplace reeks of socialism.
It literally is a form of it. The problem, I guess, for me, and this is where when I'm talking to liberals or conservatives about this, I don't use the S word. I'm not going to point to it as that unless they actually ask about it.
Is that dishonest? Is that dishonest?
No, it really isn't, because it's a matter of dealing with basic psychology. You've dealt with decades and decades of propaganda associating certain words with something. There's a knee-jerk response, and you'll dig in your heels and say, no, I can't do this. But as soon as you explain what the idea is, I've had people all over the place. I've had tons of right-wingers say, yes, I am absolutely down for that. And they have no idea that I just described syndicalist socialism to them. I mean, people aren't turned off to left-wing ideas. They've been taught to fear certain labels. And there's a tribalistic component to our politics now. And a lot of that reflects the turns in the mass media and in the political parties. And that tribalism trumps everything else. If you run smack into that, you've already lost the argument. If we instead focus on the ideas, if we really get back to effective rhetoric and effective framing, I think we can draw the working class back to the left.
Okay.
That's why I think that bold ideas could be more inspiring And exactly the point here is you don't have to characterize when we say, oh, we want democracy in the workplace. Again, that's a very abstract kind of way of talking about it. Why do we have to? I mean, if they come to realize that democracy in the workplace is great because it means various things that empower them, that improve their lives, wonderful. But you don't need to sell them on some abstract idea of democracy in the workplace. What you need to do is, be able to really promote some of the concrete things that you could change in your workplace that would give you more power, more say so, improve your life. That's what people want. I mean, then they might realize that they want democracy in the workplace. But to be honest, it is abstract. And after years and years, and especially if your union, as Liam was pointing out, if they have this kind of very pessimistic and negative approach to it, why would you want to do all of the work that's involved? For such small gains, it's not very encouraging. And that's also the problem, is that I think right now we do have a democracy deficit. People don't really have a lot of trust in democracy. Mm-hmm. What have their experiences of what is called democracy actually been leading to in terms of real gains and changes in their life? So it's almost like you're associating with something that sounds like it's legitimate and what you would hope could work, but not something that's effective and actually improved your life or given you a say-so. I mean, we have a democracy. We call our system of government a democracy, but people feel very isolated and alienated. That's why they wanted somebody like Liam, who was going to go and be bold and shake things up and actually try and bring some benefits. And the problem is that their experience of democracy is that you vote, you don't get anything in return, and the government always seems to be the same. Okay, yes, there are some differences, but in real material terms, does it really benefit or change my life? People think, no, it doesn't. So why would we want to sell workers on democracy in the workplace until we have created a culture of democracy that actually means something to them, what it really is supposed to mean, which is that power comes from below, from the people?
Yeah, I think there's something in that bridges to something that you've been pointing us toward for the discussion this week, and we keep laying down interesting thoughts that we can come back to. So right. We have to keep doing this. But the whole idea of relating it to third worldism and to colonialism and all that, because what you're dealing with in a lot of the anti-colonial struggles is someone from the outside preaching at them that we're trying to bring benefits to you. We're doing this for your own good here. We're a democracy. We want you to be a democracy too. Yay, human rights. And at the same time, you're being shot by them and they're shooting each other. So you don't see the humanism. It comes out looking like a total fraud. So your mental association is democracy is bad. Democracy means they're going to roll tanks down my street. So you don't really, so it gets to that, like, you need a positive association with it. If we had a lot of from the below worker agitation talking about an alternative model, if people were really taking bold steps and saying we could have real democracy in the workplace, if we had a rebirth of like syndicalist unions talking about what we really could achieve, in the long run here, then you can start to have those conversations pointing us toward workplace democracy. But right now, it doesn't mean anything to anybody because they don't have the language for it. No one's done the education. It gets back to the Gramsci reference from a few weeks back. Like you have to get in there and do basic education for the working class so you know what are our goals, what can we accomplish here. Until you do that, the words don't mean anything.
So the RWDSU, the union that was supposed to organize in Bessemer, the Retail, Wholesale, and Department Store Union, can we blame them for not making the case? I mean, what is the role of a union in organizing? Who don't they have to sell unions to the workers?
I mean, you can, but not exclusively. It's a much bigger issue. There's a much bigger failing overall. It's basically like, you ever see those old cartoons where somebody sticks their finger in a crack and Hoover Dam or something, and obviously it's not going to work. That's kind of what you're expecting the union to do, to make up for an entire century of propaganda against unions and get people on board. That decline has been very, very steady for a long, long time. So yeah, I mean, anybody could do better. We can always do better, but to expect them on their own to have reached those workers and changed their minds, I think is unfair.
Well, and also, what's the real value for blaming them? I think all we can do is learn from that experience. This is not going to be the only time that there are Amazon workers who want a better deal and want a better situation. And maybe it'll happen in a state that isn't a right-to-work state. Maybe it'll happen in a state where there's a greater sort of union culture available, and maybe then it'll be successful. But it's not going to be successful if we don't learn how to improve the organizing.
So you don't think there's any value to clarity and accountability?
Well, there is, but what are we going to do? Say we're not going to organize now? We have to organize, so we just have to learn, and we have to. I'm sure they are looking self-reflectively as well. It's like, what went well, what didn't go well, what tactics.
It was a disaster. It was a disaster.
Yeah. There's always room for improvement, but I think that we have to avoid the danger of the circular firing squad. We have to keep our eye on the real enemy here. You keep our eye on the goals and try to improve the processes each time. So yes, they can look back, like Professor Hussein saying, I'm sure they're looking at, oh gosh, we really screwed the pooch on this one. How do we do better next time? And we can learn from their examples. But to spend time in recriminations, I think just distracts us and it can demoralize people. I mean, and there was a good point too about maybe being able to make better progress in states that don't have the right to work laws. Amazon has a ton of warehouses in the Inland Empire of Southern California, and California has really good worker protections, and we have failed to unionize all of them.
And they're destroying the environment.
We have the worst air quality in the state by far, and among the worst in the entire country in the two Inland Empire counties here because of that warehousing emphasis. But and
they're bad jobs. They sell it to, it's Riverside. I've driven through there, and they sell it to the government officials. These are great jobs, and they're really not.
It's going to be all robots in a few years anyway. Right. So yeah, the whole thing is a giant scam. But if we can't do it in California, it's hard for me to think to blame a union in Alabama for not pulling it off, because there are so many.
Well, it's not a union in Alabama. They're a union in Connecticut run by a Harvard Law graduate.
But I mean, but acting on the ground there, trying to sway people on the ground to support this. It's hard for me to say, I'm going to blame those workers for not going along with what the union was saying when we can't do it in California either.
Professor Hussein, I want to go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, it was a failure. Maybe we will learn that other unions are more successful in their approach and organizing, and we should turn to some of them that are more successful. Some people would suggest perhaps we put it all on Bessemer, like the whole fate of the union struggle. It's almost like these poor people who just, are struggling here now have to bear the burden of the entire left, the entire, union drive. Why not organize multiple locations simultaneously? Why not try some different tactics?
Christian Smalls from Stop Amazon Now was on earlier, and he's organizing the Staten Island Fulfillment Center, and he's forming his own union.
Mm-hmm.
Amazon workers.
I put a lot more faith in somebody who has come from that particular warehouse, who knows the people, who knows those circumstances, is a courageous person, who's willing to be bold. I would give that a much greater chance. And, I would look to union leadership coming up from these workers themselves rather than bringing in, you said, a Connecticut union with a Harvard law. Okay, they may have some benefits and skills, but if you're talking about how do you communicate with these workers, who better than Christian Smalls to talk to his compadres who he's worked with, who they know him, they trust him.
He tried to save their lives.
Exactly. So he's going to have credibility in ways that somebody coming from way outside who's talking about, democracy in the workplace and abstract things because they're committed to the union struggle. That's not the problem. The problem is you have to explain why it's valuable and necessary for these folks, and so you have to engage with their particular experience. So I would look to situations like that. We need 1,000 Christian Smalls at one at every one of these fulfillment centers, and I bet you they're out there. If he would be successful, that would be very inspiring. But again, if it's only one place that's doing it, I think there's just so much attention that will come from these Amazon union busting folks. But maybe if this is happening in multiple places, they will also draw encouragement from one another. So maybe that's what we learn, is that next time you don't just put it all on one set of workers to bear the force of the entire Amazon union busting power against them.
I was looking at video of Dr. Martin Luther King when he was waging the Poor People's Campaign in Chicago. And he moved in to the tenements with the rats and Coretta. They lived among the people they were trying to lift. They didn't stay in hotels. Seems to me if you're organizing a union, you should be living, you either should be working there or living among these people. This
is where I would amplify Professor Hussein's point, and I think we need to decentralize a bit. And this is where, again, you're instead of dealing with like the large existing union infrastructures or outside agitators or this or that, but really trying to encourage workers to care. And that gets back to just better worker education in the first place, so that people feel inspired and they can inspire others to reach out there and try to do those things.
Right. By the way, if you subscribe to Payday Report, Mike Elk is doing great work at Payday Report. We're chalking up victories every day. There's, if you go to Payday Report, there are about 1,100 strikes going on at any given time here in the United States. You're not going to hear about it, but we do chalk up victories. Is democracy and fascism completely antithetical?
Sort of. Obviously any kind of authentic democracy it's opposed to, and the same that fascism is completely antithetical to worker organization, to labor power.
Can you have fascism without democracy?
Well, fascism normally does not have democracy, but
no, I'm saying, do you have to live through the breakdown of democracy in order for the people to support a strong man?
Absolutely not. And
isn't that what happened in Rome? Isn't that what happened in Germany? Isn't that what happened in?
No, not really. I mean, the democracy was doing its thing overall, but people still were attracted to these ideas. One of the things that I think would help people now looking at it, though, is to make one of the sharper distinguishing points between post-war neo-fascism and the classic era fascism, is that modern fascists actually do intend to retain a lot of the trappings of democracy. They don't generally say, I want a military government. And
like Augustus.
Yeah, I mean, well, I don't know, like a Mussolini, or a Hitler or a Franco, who absolutely controls the government.
Didn't Augustus, the Caesar, didn't he keep all the trappings of democracy? He didn't even call himself.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we could have some fun conversations there. I love teaching ancient Mediterranean, and Professor Hussein does them. There's a lot of that Mediterranean history too. So, but yeah, no, he pretended to elevate the Senate and to restore the Senate's power, but they were basically a front. So he basically let them save face so they could seem like they're still powerful. And he's, behind the scenes like, you're going to do this because I've got the army. Right. But that's more what they're aiming for now. That's actually more the neo-fascist model. Putin holds regular elections in Russia. We all know they're BS, but he holds them anyway. So some element of democracy is compatible with fascism, but actual democracy is completely antithetical to it.
And do people turn to fascism because democracy has failed? Is that because that in ancient Rome and in Greece, they had something resembling a republic or a democracy, and do they turn to a strongman because they lose faith in the democratic process?
I think it's more a matter of the circumstances not being able to be addressed through the democratic process, as opposed to totally losing faith in the system. It's the circumstances that bother people more. I mean, the Roman state drifted farther and farther into authoritarianism because as the state got larger and larger and had more and more slaves, you became more and more dependent on the military, and you just sort of that their power naturally increased, and it couldn't deal with all the different problems that it came up with. But it's really not as simple as saying people are losing faith in the system, because people stayed active and engaged with the democratic process, whether you're talking about the classic fascist era or the contemporary world or the Roman world. I mean, Rome was in some ways more democratic than we tend to think. The popular assemblies still had plenty of participation in the late Republican period. And people didn't stop showing up to those just because the army was important.
Right, right. It seems like America right now is ripe for fascism because we hate Washington, D.C. I think Nancy Pelosi was way more unpopular than Donald Trump. Is that fair? I think if you polled most Americans, they don't trust Washington, D.C.
Mm-hmm.
So
Trump frequently has an approval rating in the single digits.
Right.
I mean, yeah, people have come to hate it, but that's part of that is a long-term process. And it's not that the one leads to the other. In some ways, you got to flip that around. Take it back to some of the agitation you saw across the 70s, and then the rise of Reagan arguing government is the problem. And then you intentionally appoint incompetent people or corrupt people to government bureaucracies, and use the regulatory capture features there to drive them into the ground as a way to rationalize saying, look, government clearly sucks, let me privatize it. So it's understandable that people would come to distrust government when you're completely and deliberately mismanaging it, but at the same time, not saying that honestly,
Did the Nazis by the late 30s, were they big government, or did they turn a lot of government functions over to the private sector?
They did both. It's a real mix. The Nazis did not have a clear economic ideology. They always straddled the fence there. They were always centrist on it. There were times in which they massively increased direct investment to stimulate, production and whatnot, kind of big government-y type stuff. And they also privatized significant chunks of the old Weimar state because they had to make a deal with the traditional ruling class to get in power in the first place. So it's really it's sort of an agnostic approach. The thing that mattered to the Nazis only was that the economy needed to serve the interests of the nation, of like the German ethnic nation. As long as it was doing that, they were fine, whatever form it took.
How does it work, Professor Hussein, in terms of human nature? Because we're both cooperative and authoritarian at the same time. It's how we're nurtured, right? If you're raised like Donald Trump, you're authoritarian. And if you're raised in a communal situation, you learn to cooperate. This country is moving. It's just, I think it's creating more and more authoritarians because there's no community taking care of one another.
Yes, well, I think a lot of the structures or experiences people would have had of larger scale cooperation outside of, say, their family unit have waned. We don't have as many of those kinds of experiences that encourage or create positive associations with cooperation, and everything in our society seems to militate to individual choices, individual responsibilities, of pitting people, imagining them competing at every level with other people for scarce resources, whether it's actual material benefits or even attention with social media and the way now everybody is just competing for attention and views and followers, and that very structure is something that pits people against one another, that doesn't encourage cooperation and collaboration. So I think that's a big problem of neoliberalism and of the decline of some of those corporate institutions. I mean, corporate as in collective institutions. People's religious communities, their unions, their even those kind of associations that at least did good works in the community. These kinds of things. I don't know if they're as strong as they once were. One heartening thing I've seen out of this COVID environment have been these mutual aid societies. That is a really positive attempt to create and reforge communal, collective action together outside of their elected governments or other NGOs, even the NGOs, but people doing things together and using the networking capacity that we have through social. And that's a very positive use of social media and these forms of communication to sponsor collective action. I'm hopeful about.
Can you give me an example of a mutual aid society?
Well, we have one here in Kingston that immediately, as soon as the pandemic started, a few friends of mine from the kind of lefty activist community created a Facebook mutual aid Cataraqui, which is the indigenous term for Kingston, and it exploded in terms of people who participated in the group, who connected with the group, and within a couple of weeks, there were several thousand people in not a very large community of 120,000 who were part of it, who self-organized for people who were had extreme, immunocompromised situations, elderly who were living alone, various ways people identified themselves as needing some assistance, would explain what it was that they needed, and you would get volunteers and organize people to bring food, make deliveries, pick up medicine, and so on, in order to keep people safe. Other people who were going through real difficulties, losing jobs, cutting back on hours, collections were taken up of in-kind as well as monetary support. And this all just happened organically through voluntaristic engagement out of a desire to help your neighbors.
Okay, so explain this to me, Dr. O'Mara, Professor Hussein. I live in New York City in an apartment building. I would say I have 1,500 neighbors. Now think about this for a second. I have 1,500, let's say 1,000 neighbors, okay? 20 stories up in the air. I don't know how many people live here. Let's say 1,000 people live here. And there's a laundry room downstairs, and they have like a little lending library. And people leave books, and it's done very judiciously, and it's beautiful. If I were to say to my neighbors, hey, let's all meet in the lobby and figure out what we could share, they would think I'm insane. I go to when I empty my recycling, I see Martha's New York Times. Today, I don't subscribe, I do it digitally. I would like a hard copy, and I see it in the blue recycling bin. And I wouldn't dare to touch her New York Times. Even though it's in the recycling, it has her name on it. That's her New York Times, and it's hers to throw out. That's how proprietary we are.
Well, I recall actually a case where people who didn't have homes and had to scavenge on the streets collected from recycling bins the cans that you can get deposits and receive money back, being charged with theft
and taxed. Yeah, and you
well,
can be taxed if barter. You get taxed for barter in the United States.
Yeah, and municipalities have tried to clamp down on a lot of these things because it can lower the property values if there's a place that people are putting out their stuff to give up, like, free sofa or whatever. Where I grew up, we would just put stuff out, but that looks kind of, I don't know, quote unquote ghetto to some people. So the NIMBYs lobby the municipalities, say you can't do that anymore, so you get rid of it. So I lose an easy place where I can give things up. And then we have to make contact with absolutely everybody and reach out to some and see what do they need. I think people would naturally share stuff very easily if they had a space to do it.
There's no reason. I mean, that's what Uber and Airbnb, share your ride. It was ride sharing after the Great Recession. Uber, it's communal. I have a car, I'll drive you, and you pay me. But has anybody created a website by zip code where people can? They have.
There are, and even there are places where you can do things through Facebook. They have like a free or for sale, and you can just post something up, hey, free TV, and people in your local area can come and get it because they'll see the ad for it. And obviously Craigslist does that. And there's a ton of specialized ones. I can tell you from experience that I have hitchhiked and couch surfed all over the Middle East and parts of Europe. You just go onto couchsurfing.com, whatever, like make arrangements. Hey, somebody says, hey, I've got a sofa, you can crash here. And in exchange for me getting to use the sofa, they get a nice conversation over coffee in the morning.
I would love to, we have a bit of an infrastructure here, Professor Hussein, especially on office hours. I would love to create a website for the community where you list all the things that you are willing to share. Venmo me the postage. I will mail you my car. I'm joking about the car, but if you have, I have a book. Here's a list of books. If anybody everybody writes down what they're willing to share, and all you do is, include the postage.
I bet it could be organized on Discord. We just need to get Andy Brown on the case. But what I would say is we have a very dispersed audience that is global in some respects. I mean, certainly at least Europe, all the way to the Pacific coast, the U.S., and maybe beyond. So is it ecologically the best idea to send things back and forth across this vast geography? People should do this in their local communities. I mean, this is what what makes sense. I mean, what I would love to see, and I think I've talked about it on the Discord meeting that they have for shop geeks, about how I wish that we had a tool library locally. Because I've got a bunch of projects and it's a lot of money to sink into tools that, let's be honest, I don't even really know how to use very well. But if I had a tool library in the neighborhood and I could talk with people about how to use it, make a contribution, buy a couple of tools to be in that tool library that others could use and share, see what doesn't exist already. That would be so useful and so helpful. And we could do things like that. I think
the infrastructure is already there, Professor. It's called a library. Libraries have really gone from just books to videotapes. Why not seize our libraries and demand that they share tools and turn them into real socialist institutions? Because
Republicans will say that's communism. It can be a hard sell at the municipal level, especially since, especially as Democrats have drifted farther right too. But in a lot of places, people just don't get involved in city councils or county boards either. So you end up with a virtual lock. Even in some areas with a majority of Democratic voters, you'll have, almost all the city council members are Republicans because they're the ones with the money that want to control the council, and we're not engaged. And they're never going to authorize that because. But
I've lived in California. I know Northern California and Oregon and parts of Washington. There's no reason we can't have a bunch of lefties seize the library.
It's a good organizing goal. And actually, we did something like that way back when. Do you remember the lawsuits over taping and then later over like CDs and whatnot? You know, the record labels are pissed and I'm not going to go buy the vinyl if I can just tape it off the radio. And they're like trying to stop us from recording stuff. The library stood up for that. And they said, no, we're straight up going to like offer the tapes and put them in there. And they started collecting CDs and cassettes and video cassettes. And you know what? If I can rent a CD or a cassette at the library, I can copy it at home. There's nothing to stop that. And the libraries did it anyway. But they had to push back against the labels in order to do that. And in order to do that, we had to build the organizing strength to push the municipalities to give them the spine. And I don't think anyone's bothered. And part of that, I think, is just that these institutions are all struggling at this point. Younger people tend not to go to them. They have the internet or whatever, so they don't go to the libraries.
Libraries are a miracle. Everybody, you have a patriotic duty to get a library card and then make some noise. They go, shh. That's the problem with libraries. They say, shh, no, make noise at a library. Borrow lots of books and demand things from your library and then take it over and have them lend you cars and tools and hammers.
It's on us to push back against it because it has been a cultural shift in the last few generations. And the same thing that's led a lot of communal organizations, the fraternal societies, religious institutions to people don't join them. Gen X is less of a joiner than the boomers were. Millennials are less of a joiner than Gen X. People just don't show up to things. They don't want to attend something physically. So, I mean, the same thing that's hurting a lot of those institutions is also hurting libraries, but we could reclaim those spaces. You know, from an organization.
What about churches, mosques, and temples? I mean, what a perfect. I'd love to see the government. I'd love to see the government tell a church to stop lending tools and cars.
Right. Yeah. No. A lot of, and they should. I mean, I went to a shul for quite some time that had a lending library that you could just walk in and just take whatever you wanted. It was fine. Like they didn't care. And I've seen Catholic churches that do things like that. They have to make the decision to do it, but the way that they're going to take those decisions in the first place is us asking for it and showing a real interest. There has to be a communal interest.
Real estate, most religious organizations, their houses of worship are empty, not because of the pandemic. They're just empty and they're sitting on all this valuable real estate. They can't get people to come on Saturdays and Sundays and Friday nights. Do something, make it in our Henry Huckamaki. I see your hand raised. You talked about religious organizations and how they actually feed people and they make it worth people's while to show up. There's an opportunity to feed the hungry or to get fed.
Yeah, I'm a big proponent of mutual aid, and I think that the left needs to do a better job of doing mutual aid. And frankly, there's a lot of, and these aren't people that are on the left, but there's a lot of rich liberals who are willing to spend a lot of money on political campaigns, Mike Bloomberg, who, if they actually cared about winning elections on the left, they would use that money, the hundreds of millions of dollars that they're spending on campaign ads and this and that, and the staff that they said that they were going to pay, and then they didn't, and then they did. They could use that money to open feeding shelters. They could open, housing shelters. They could open all kinds of different programs to address vital needs within society and say, hey, this is out of my love for you as a fellow human being. Just so you know, I was the one who did this, but it's out of my love for you. Well, when you have the Republicans saying those Democrats are demonic, satanic creatures, they've been feeding you breakfast. It doesn't ring true at that point. And people from, the liberal center to the left, and it's harder on the left because we just don't have money on the left, but the liberal center to the left needs to do a better job of delivering mutual aid to communities that need it. In my view, I know that there are groups that attempt to do it, but Dr.
Liam O'Mara you ran for Congress. hopefully you'll run again. Howie Klein and I want you to run again. The consultant class, it's in all the money goes to the consultant class, right?
Yeah, it is ungodly expensive to run.
Because of why? Because of the
Well, in part because anything just costs money. Even if you skip the consultants, which we did because the strategies they would recommend for this area are honestly all bullshit. They have no idea how you could actually win in the area, which is why we did so much better than previous campaigns. You can skip a lot of those things, but if you want to send out mailers, wow, that's expensive. If you want radio time or television time, I mean, the Inland Empire is part of the LA media market.
right.
You know, even though we're a lot poorer, I got to pay LA costs. So yeah, there's no way we're on television. You know, and to put enough people on the streets knocking doors, you got to not only provide the supplies for that, but you got to throw something at them too to encourage them to keep coming back weekend after weekend and putting the time into it. Everything costs money. So we could work our fingers to the bone all for free, like doing our thing, massive volunteer campaign, but there are a lot of institutional advantages that the candidates have that can spend $1 million on radio and TV ads.
Right, right. Well, this was great. Professor Adnan Hussein teaches religion. He is a medieval scholar. He is chairman of the religion department at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. He hosts 2 podcasts, Guerrilla History with Henry Huckamaki and the Mudgeless podcast. And Dr. Liam O'Mara is a professor of history and a professor of ideas. And hopefully he's going to run for office again. Please plug away.
Well, if you want to point to like the podcast, me and several other alumnus in the area from the different campaigns are launching our own little media company. And we're going to have a series of different shows there. Myself and another canceled former politician are going to have a show called Canceled, and we're on different sides of the political spectrum there. So we're going to have a nice running debate, and then bring on guests to talk issues. And then I'm going to resurrect the old YouTube stuff that I used to do under office hours with the Mad Professor, where I can talk about history and politics. And then I found that a lot of people actually liked my little philosophy discussions. So I'm making again a play on the pop culture. I'm going to have a set of videos out there called Virtue Signaling, where I'm going to talk about, how we can apply, philosophy to daily life, to live better.
All right, I'm going to end.
I mean, all under kind of like the Rogue Media banner, So we're launching a little Rogue Media.
I'm going to go around the horn, and I need a yes or no answer. On Wednesday, the Facebook Supreme Court will issue their ruling as to whether or not Donald Trump can return to Facebook and Instagram. Should they allow Donald Trump back on Facebook and Instagram? Yes or no, Henry Huckamaki?
Yes.
Professor Adnan Hussein?
Yes.
Professor Dr. Liam O'Mara?
Yes.
The answer is no. Bye-bye. That's my John McLaughlin imitation from the McLaughlin group. No.
It's tough. I mean, on the one hand, you really have to hope that sunlight is the best disinfectant, and we have to be able to engage.
That's what Donald Trump said.
But we did manage to pull ahead of him. We got a lousy candidate, but we did pull ahead of him in the election. People did see it. I don't know. It's tough to argue for completely pushing somebody out, even though he is actually able to develop a massive following, and a cult of personality, around that. So it does give him something. So I totally get where you're coming from, but I don't think it helps us to shut it down. The parallel I would make, and I don't know if Professor Hussein would see the same thing here in his work there, but if you look at the history of extremist movements around the world, or in the Middle East in particular, when governments have directly suppressed them, they have tended to get stronger, because you can point to that suppression, and use and exploit the grievance. And Trumpists are doing that right now.
Watch this. Henry, let's test this.
Okay.
Henry, you raised your hand.
I did.
But we're out of time. Let's test the theory.
Well, I mean, I can.
I'm
Watch
kidding.
out, the Henry Rage. It's coming.
Okay, so the reason I came
Thank goodness
back,
he's going to Germany. He'll be far away from me.
Let's not let Henry talk to test Dr. O'Mara's there. No, I'm kidding. Go ahead.
Well, the reason I came back was because I was listening while I was upstairs doing some stuff, and I heard mentions of third world / colonized peoples. I heard talk of the mindset of the suppressed. And so I came back with a quote from The Wretched of the Earth that I was going to read out. And
what is The Wretched of the Earth?
It's a book by Frantz Fanon, who was a psychotherapist and revolutionary, particularly in Algeria. But he was very much looking into the mindset and the psychology of colonized peoples. And The Wretched of the Earth, which was his last thing that he did. He was dying of leukemia at the time, at the age of 39. He was already blind, dying of leukemia, dictated the book to his wife over the course of 10 weeks immediately before he died. That book is still considered one of the seminal texts in understanding the third world and colonized peoples. And the reason I raised my hand just now, I was going to leave this quote off for some other time, but you mentioned again this mindset of people that are being suppressed, and this fits in perfectly with the quote. So if you don't mind, I can read this quote and then I'll sign off.
And I'll just say before Henry does it that we were going to talk about Césaire and Fanon and other anti-colonial thinkers and their relationship and critique of fascism. But we'll do that
next
maybe in a couple of weeks.
Yeah, it's a funny coincidence. I was actually going to be doing the same thing, quoting Fanon tonight. So.
Do you realize Henry is like just turned 42? It's amazing. You're 42, right, Henry?
No, I'm 26.
Note to self, yell at all my children. Go ahead.
Okay, so I'm just going to go through this. And yeah.
You talk, I'm just going to call my kids up and yell at them.
Sure, but David, I want you to listen to this.
Okay.
Because this is important to understand. The colonized man will first manifest the aggressiveness which has been deposited in his bones against his own people. This is the period when the N-words beat each other up, and the people and magistrates do not know which way to turn when faced with the astonishing waves of crime. Where individuals are concerned, a positive negation of common sense is evident, while the settler or the policeman has the right the livelong day to strike the native, to insult him and make him crawl to them. You'll see the native reaching for his knife at the slightest hostile or aggressive glance cast on him by another native. For the last resort of the native is to defend his personality vis-a-vis his brother. Tribal feuds only serve to perpetuate old grudges buried deep in the memory. By throwing himself with all his force into the vendetta, the native tries to persuade himself that colonialism does not exist, that everything is going on as before, that history continues. It is as if plunging into a fraternal bloodbath allowed them to ignore the obstacle and to put off until later the choice, nevertheless inevitable, which opens up the question of armed resistance to colonialism. Thus, collective auto-destruction in a very concrete form is one of the ways in which the native's muscular tension is set free. All these patterns of conduct are those of the death reflex when faced with danger, a suicidal behavior which proves to the settler that these men are not reasonable human beings. In the same way, the native manages to bypass the settler. A belief in fatality removes all blame from the oppressor. The cause of misfortunes and of poverty is attributed to God. He is fate. In this way, the individual accepts the disintegration ordained by God, bows down before the settler and his lot, and by a kind of interior restabilization acquires a stony calm. It has always happened in the struggle for freedom that such a people, formerly lost in an imaginary maze, a prey to unspeakable terrors, yet happy to lose themselves in a dreamlike torment, such a people becomes unhinged, reorganizes itself, and in blood and tears gives birth to very real and immediate action. The oppressor starts the process of domination, of exploitation, and of robbery. In the other sphere, the coiled, plundered creature, which the native provides fuel for the process as best he can. The process moves uninterruptedly from the banks of the colonial territory to the palaces and the docks of the mother country. In this becalmed zone, the sea has a smooth surface. The palm trees stir gently in the breeze, the waves lap against the pebbles, and raw materials are ceaselessly transported, justifying the presence of the settler. And all the while, the native, bent double, more dead than alive, exists intermittently in an unchanging dream. The settler makes history, his life an epoch, an odyssey. He is the absolute beginning. This land was created by us. He is the unceasing cause. If we leave, all is lost, and the country will go back to the Middle Ages. The native is boxed into a corner. Apartheid is simply one form of the division into compartments of the colonial world. The first thing which the native learns is to stay in his place and not go beyond certain limits. This is why the dreams of the native are always of muscular prowess. His dreams are of action and of aggression. I dream I am jumping, swimming, running, climbing. I dream that I burst out laughing, that I span a river in one stride, or that I'm followed by a flood of motor cars which never catch up with me. During the period of colonization, the native never stops achieving his freedom from 9 in the evening until 6 in the morning.
Thank you. Let's do this, please, next week. Please, please, please. You're listening to The David Feldman Show, davidfeldmanshow.com.